It all started with Commodus, the last of the Antonines, whom you should know from the movie Gladiator. Of course, no former General Maximus killed him, but Commodus really liked to fight gladiators in the arena, kept a harem of girls and boys, indulged in all sorts of perversions, and cared about politics only in terms of introducing new taxes on his own entertainment, which is why he was beaten by his own confidants. One of them, the freedman Pertinax, was declared emperor, but in 80 days he managed to turn away the support of the praetorians and was stabbed to death. The next emperor was Julian, who won the bidding arranged by the praetorians for the throne. But he couldn't pay for the purchase, and 60 days later he was arrested and stabbed to death. Seeing all this, 3 military leaders at once, at the head of their legions, proclaimed themselves emperors and staged a 4-year-long war, from which Septimius Severus emerged victorious in 197. In principle, there was nothing new for Rome in this, since 100 years before that, the first of the 5 good Caesars, Vespasian, also won in the same conflict. But the difference was that while Vespasian relied on Roman nobility in his reign, the power of Severus and his dynasty relied solely on the army, which they nurtured and nurtured, maintaining loyalty with money. But Septimius Severus became the last emperor under whom the old scheme of functioning of the army worked. Rome still waged offensive wars, oppressing the Persians, Parthians, and Germans, and fueling its economy with reparations. But these were the last echoes of Roman military expansion. There were no more enemies around Rome, rich enough that the income from the campaign exceeded the cost of organizing it, and at the same time weak enough. Even under the successors of Septimius, campaigns against the rich Persians and Parthians turned out to be failures, since the key lands of these empires were located beyond deserts unfamiliar to the Romans, where legionaries suffered more from heat and poor supplies than from enemy attacks. The Germans, for all their ferocity and aggressiveness, could not become a source of at least some significant production. There is not so much gold and silver in the forests of Central and Eastern Europe, and slaves alone will not pay for the campaign. Rome was forced to switch to strategic defense, which completely deprived the military of the opportunity to enrich itself on military campaigns, fighting on its own territory. Now Roman military leaders could only shed a few tears at the times of Lucullus, Caesar, Pompey, and other great military leaders who significantly improved their finances during the conquests. At the same time, service in the army itself turned from an honorable privilege into a not particularly pleasant duty. In the absence of external campaigns against rich countries, the financial income from the service became quite scanty, as well as the chance of obtaining a land plot after service. In such conditions, the poor had to be recruited into the legions, to whom the army salary might seem like a lot of money. But it would be a mistake to expect such an army to be interested in service. The war with the Germans or other barbarians became a tragedy, since you could die but win nothing. So the withdrawal of the legion to the Rhine or Danube border could turn into a mutiny of soldiers who did not want to die under the swords of savages. Septimius Severus understood all this, so he increased the salaries of soldiers and officers, but the treasury of Rome is not bottomless, and it is always necessary to maintain an army on the borders. Therefore, as soon as the old emperor died, the army first of all took care that the throne passed to the candidate, who promised to preserve and increase all privileges. The army became not an instrument of the emperor's power, but a subject of politics. Even one military failure was enough for the emperor to be sent to feed worms. If Septimius's successors had been at least a little more talented and intelligent, maybe the empire would have emerged from this crisis without significant losses, but that was exactly what was unlucky. The apotheosis was the ascension to the throne of Elagabalus, who worshipped the statue of a giant phallus. On the 5th emperor of the Severov dynasty, Alexander, in 235, this whole celebration of life ended. Throughout the empire, the legions began to proclaim their commanders as emperors. Over the next 30 years, the legions proclaimed 29 emperors. Each new soldier's emperor promised his legions large monetary gifts in case of victory, armed himself with the slogan, "I will come to Rome to restore order," and marched on the capital. The loyalty of the commander to the central government was expressed in the ability of this power to nail everyone by force, the loyalty of soldiers to their emperor, his ability to pay legionaries for loyalty. Even after defeating all competitors in the struggle, piecing together the empire and shedding a sea of blood, the new emperor found that his victory was relative, and the degree of control over the empire was minimal. Trust turned into a luxury. Anyone could betray and rebel, even a childhood friend or relative. The troops could leave you at any moment and go to your opponent because he offered more, and it all started in a circle. The empire was devouring itself in an endless cycle of violence, and it doesn't matter if you are really a patriot of the empire or just raised this beautiful slogan for legitimization in the eyes of the population and your soldiers. Almost all the applicants acted in the same space of ideas. I need power in order to live in prosperity, and power without Rome is worthless. Selfishness and thirst for power, elevated to the absolute, suddenly turned into a virtue that allowed the constantly disintegrating empire to be reassembled, fueled by the old belief that life exists only in Rome. You could rule your piece of empire as much as you wanted. But without Rome, where all the wealth flows, you are nothing. You will be crushed, and therefore, Rome must be mine. Tactically, each candidate could promise the restoration of the power of the Senate or democracy, but in fact, it meant nothing. They all acted guided by one idea: to gain full power over the empire. The motives were unimportant. The goals could change depending on the circumstances, but the means, in the form of military dictatorship, as the only possible form of power in such conditions, were inevitable, and absolute victory was impossible. The war feeds the army. The threat of a new rebellion serves as a strong lever of pressure, forcing them to fork out, but the treasury has long been leaky. Administrative management under the conditions of alternating emperors and governors degraded and collapsed, and tax collection now looked more like punitive operations. Just imagine yourself in the place of an ordinary peasant somewhere in Illyria. You are 40 years old, and a dozen emperors have already changed in your life. And right now, there are 3 or 4 of them, and you do not know which of them is better or worse. On whose side is the truth? The fact that Rome has already introduced the 4th military tax, and you already have nothing to eat because of the drought and robbers, or those others who promise to restore order. But upon arrival, immediately cancel the old emergency taxes and introduce new ones. Crowds of legionnaires march through your province every year to or from Rome. Legionnaires more like bandits, and crowds of bandits more like legionnaires roam. The army needs to be supplied, but in conditions of general collapse, no quartermaster services are functioning. Warehouses have long been plundered, and officials either fled or began to behave like bandits, which means you need to get everything yourself. Requisition on the way. But for you, a peasant, it looks like ordinary looting. If you are lucky, they will simply take away all your food. The soldiers, in fact, do not care whether you starve to death or not. War feeds war. Human life is worthless. And sometimes the same soldiers or bandits come, but for taxes, and you already have nothing, and then sell the land and go either to bandits or to soldiers. They are always needed in such conditions. Of course, if you are a big latifundist, you can build walls around your villa and hire veterans to protect your land. The bandits themselves will be scared and leave, and the military leaders will not quarrel with you, because you control the territory, unlike the local governor if there is one. And if these people already de facto control and administer the territory, then why not give them the position of a local manager in order to collect taxes that are so necessary for waging endless wars? In this scheme, the emperors also benefited, who received a relatively reliable tax collection mechanism. The guards of the latifundists quickly convinced the locals that taxes should be paid, and the latifundists themselves becoming semi-independent kings who have full power in their land. Feudalism was just around the corner, so who's good or bad here? Constant wars turned the once prosperous Italy into a wasteland, where life glimmered only in cities and on the lands of the latifundists. The emperors were only concerned about taxes, but the tax base did not matter. Social Darwinism won in a single state. The survival of its inhabitants was now not even a secondary goal, but an accidental side effect. In such conditions, the capture of Rome by the emperor did not guarantee victory at all. Moreover, it became a chimera, harmful and unnecessary. You gained control over the war-ravaged territory, but you were guaranteed to lose control of the provinces from which you came. Rome finally turned into a symbol city since it controlled nothing, gave nothing to the invader in terms of resources, but required funds to maintain order, and anyone fought for power over the empire, but not its inhabitants. Formally, the empire still existed, but in fact there were several of them at any given time, each of which independently fought off the barbarian hordes who felt the blood, and each imagined themselves to be the real Rome. Moreover, the military leaders began to get the simple idea that it was better to keep what you had, and Rome was not really needed. In the west, in Gaul and Britain, and in the east, in the province of Asia, full-fledged separatist powers were already formed, the Gallic Empire and the Kingdom of Palmyra. Governed in the image and likeness of Rome, they reflected all the same problems as in the great empire, the same constant rebellions, the collapse of the economy, and the raids of barbarians. Being de facto independent, they even formally supported the succession from the empire, but they did not put the authorities of this empire in anything. Only Emperor Aurelian of Rome reunited the entire empire, but it was only 10 years later under Diocletian that it finally regained almost all the territories. But it was already a completely different empire, where only its territory and a number of decorative elements remained from the empire of Augustus, while the entire inner essence was changed beyond recognition, differing from itself. It was already a completely different empire, not the one that everyone was fighting for. And who's the bad guy or the good guy here? Who is to blame? The conspirators who killed Commodus? Or Septimius Severus, who has not found a better successor? Or any of the emperors who first destroyed and then honestly put the empire back together for the sake of personal power? And who won in the end? Aurelian? Diocletian? The empire has definitely lost. Diocletian finally won the military phase of the civil war, assembled the empire and strengthened it with a construction of shit and sticks. But Rome lost 90 years of progressive development. Instead of evolution, Diocletian was forced to make a revolution in imperial governance. For the sake of stabilization, Rome had to part with the old army. The army that was the source of power became its weakness and therefore was decentralized and disconnected so that no one else had so much power. The losses of the economy and population were enormous. Entire areas in Italy and Gaul were depopulated, where once there were houses made of stone. Now they were built of wood, and these territories would not recover until the final collapse of the Empire of the West. The empire will never recover from this war. It will lose its advantage over the barbarians, who will begin to catch up with it militarily and organizationally. Against the background of all that was happening, the inhabitants did not even really resist the changes. The stabilization of Diocletian was in every way better than it had been before, and those who could remember what the empire was like in its golden years were no longer alive. Rome is dead. Long live Rome.